Okay, so this will be the lecture for human performance field investigation on decision making and problem solving. So the goals for this lecture are to describe a framework for how humans make decisions. We're going to summarize and compare decision making models. We're going to explain how System 1 and System 2 thinking affects decision making, give examples of decision making methods, apply decision-making principles to industrial operations, and present how decision-making can fail and lead to poor outcomes. So when we look at operations decision-making or decision-making within some kind of an industrial task domain, it's important to remember operators must develop a response to a world state under uncertainty. So the definition of operational decision-making is a commitment to a course of action that is intended to yield results that are satisfying for specified individuals. So this is typically something about maximizing a business's goals, revenue, something like that. This tends to focus on macro level decision-making, which is also known as response planning. So here is an example of a cognitive model of nuclear power plant operations. For example, you have the core plant systems that are interacting directly with the human system interface. And then you have the generic primary tasks as well as the interface management tasks that are undertaken by the staff. But when we look at operations decision making, they tend to focus on this response planning, kind of a bigger picture type. All right, so getting into decision making. The first framework we're going to talk about is the adaptive decision maker framework. So this was one of the first to kind of break down decision making principles. So evaluating alternatives and making choices among them. So the framework steps, this will all seem very kind of common sense or intuitive. We identify a decision that needs made, gather relevant information, identify alternatives, weigh the evidence, choose among alternatives, take action, and then review your decision and its consequences or the response from the system or the environment. And this was kind of a way to deconstruct what our brains do very quickly and somewhat subconsciously. But it is kind of one of those initial stabs at trying to make sense of that. So when we go through here, we're going to be looking at different decision-making paradigms. So we're going to focus a little bit on normative models. So this is the what should we do, how should we be making decisions. Descriptive models, so what do people actually do, behavioral studies and such. And then lastly, naturalistic models, so the most representative of experts. So what and how do experts make decisions in these kind of uncertain environments? So normative decision-making models, which tends to filter down into classical decision theory, or you'll hear that term sometimes, they initially came from economists, statisticians. Also, you'll hear about this from management theory or scientific management is a term that was thrown around in the early 1900s. But what we're looking at for these are they tried to identify optimal decision-making principles. So we have expected utility theory, where it's assumed that people make decisions based on some expected utility. Then you had the economic man and woman theory, which made three key assumptions about decision making that will be very familiar if you've taken an economics course, but it assumes that decision makers are fully informed, they are infinitely sensitive, and they're fully rational. So they will always select the optimal option when presented that way. And it tends to describe how decisions should be made. And these theories were largely criticized as not representative of how decisions are actually made by real people. And that led into the push for descriptive decision-making models. So this was an attempt to better understand how decisions are actually made by people and how decision-making under risk occurs. It tends to be largely based on bounded rationality theory, so the idea that humans are rational within some circumscribed limit. It tends to put forward a subjective expected utility. So you have two components of that. You have the subjective utility, so the judged weightings of utility, not the objective utility. So this is, what does the decision maker judge to be the utility? And then subjective probabilities, so calculation of our own estimated likelihoods, not, again, an objective likelihood. And then this led to prospect theory, which came about with Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky in the 70s. It largely captures risk aversion in choices involving sure gains and risk, seeing in choices and risk seeking, in choices involving sure losses. So it was a focus on trying to understand risk aversion and how that influences decision making, and how, we'll see this with certain gambling fallacies and different things like that. This also might be reminiscent of behavioral economics, so that, can be referred to as when economists discovered psychology. But behavioral economics, Dan Ariely's work, or the Freakonomics, those kind of theories are about how people do make decisions and then they try to, in a post hoc way, kind of suss out why that is the way it is. And then we got to naturalistic decision-making models. So this captures more realistic decisions that are made within the context of some larger task or goal. So this is, most naturalistic decision-making models or methods will capture time pressure, uncertainty, quality of goal definitions, and different stakes. The four critical naturalistic decision-making characteristics are a focus on cognitive process. Decision makers judge alternatives in terms of reaching goal as opposed to an A versus B comparison. Expert decision makers are the focus, not novices or layfolk. Only realistic or feasible alternatives considered by the expert. Again, the assumption, is that the expert would have some knowledge of realism and feasibility and those things where your standard human decision maker may not. And this led to one of the first big ones by Klein, recognition prime decision model. So this flow chart over here kind of explains how recognition prime decision models work. So it was an attempt to explain expert decision making under stressful and time pressure situations. And the focus, or the thing that kind of came about from it, was that it was based on satisficing. So satisficing is a thing that we do cognitively where we pick the first least bad option, or the first best option we find. So we are comparing alternatives until a suitable option has been found. And that, even though a more optimal decision may still be out there, we take whichever one works first. And this largely breaks down across three options. Situation recognition. So we recognize the situation. It matches some experience or model that we have. Serial option evaluation and mental simulation. So when decision makers are processing through this, they will consider the various options and then execute basically mental simulations to see which one is going to be the most successful. And then some other decision-making methods. So lexicographic identifies and chooses the best alternative, or the alternative with the best value on the most important attribute. So for example, if you need to go across town, you're going to drive across town, and getting there fast is the most important attribute versus being safe, that is a way of making decisions. Satisficing just across the board in general, that came about, a long time ago there. So if that's the way you make decisions, is just you compare all options one by one and select the first one that works. Elimination by aspects. So you eliminate alternatives if they fail to meet a minimum cutoff on an attribute. This can be kind of considered the opposite of lexicographic. Group decision-making processes, so consensus, groupthink, committee-based decision, and then obviously naturalistic decision-making here. Okay, so looking at Daniel Kahneman's work, this is where we got into System 1 and System 2. So this book, Thinking Fast and Slow, was a distillation of these theories. It's a great book, but it also captures some of his work with Amos Tversky that kind of spawned all of this. And what they argue is that there are two decision-making routes. We used basically two styles of thinking as we progress through decision-making. We use System 1 and System 2. And System 1 is our fast, reactive decision-making, where System 2 involves more of our conscious thinking. It's slower, it's controlled. A good example to think about it is if somebody asks you what 2 plus 2 is, you probably don't even really think about the answer. The answer almost just appears. Where if somebody asked you what's 2,346 divided by 24, you could still complete that problem, but it's going to take a more circuitous, slower route, and you're going to have to consciously engage with the material. The answer doesn't seem to just appear the way it does with System 1. And here's some just different characteristics, advantages, and disadvantages for System 1 versus 2. And this can be helpful when we're looking at field investigations, when we're looking at trying to decipher decision-making after the fact. We can use some of these characteristics to try to untangle what decision-making mode or process the person was going through. So if somebody was moving quickly and they took actions without really reflecting on things, maybe based off of some rote practice or training-based decision-making, that is indicative of System 1, where if somebody was slow and exercised a lot of deliberate thinking, okay, then they were probably in System 2, which then we can decipher advantages and disadvantages to that and see how that impacts the broader event. So trial and error is also a way that some folks will make decisions. So they will continue trying different solutions until the problem is solved. Algorithmic decision making is one where people deploy rule-based almost decision making. So they are executing some kind of a process or procedure that guarantees a solution, but it's not necessarily an optimal solution. And then the main way, and this will be indicative also of the recognition prime decision making somewhat, is heuristic decision making. So we have some kind of guiding principle or rule of thumb that is used to solve problems. These mental shortcuts, these heuristics, lighten the cognitive load of making decisions. They are generally applicable. They generally will work in this space, but they may not guarantee a solution in that given context. And lastly, they contain biases, which will sometimes be referred to as just decision-making bias, which is different than and we'll go into some of them, but they're different than what we think of with traditional bias, such as prejudice or racism. So this was captured a lot in the Linda problem. So this was a study conducted by Tversky and Kahneman where they presented everybody with this prompt and these two options. So Linda is 31 years old, single, outspoken, and very bright. She majored in philosophy. As a student, she was deeply concerned with issues of discrimination and social justice, and she also participated in anti-nuclear demonstrations. And the prompt was, which of these two is more likely? or rank the likelihood. Linda is a bank teller, and Linda is a bank teller and is active in the feminist movement. And the study resulted that overwhelmingly people ranked it in this way, that Linda is a bank teller and is active in the feminist movement, which is what we call a conjunction fallacy. So if we consider just standard probabilistic mathematics, joint probability, so the probability of two things being true at the same time, cannot be greater than individual probability. Any one thing is more probabilistically, or has a greater probability than any two things. Now, the conjunction fallacy tends to happen as a result of the representativeness heuristic, where we tend to look at representations of individuals and how those characteristics can be spread. What's interesting about the Linda study was that 80% of people, including experienced statisticians, picked the first problem. So even people that are trained in statistics and probability were still confounded by their own cognitive processing. So representativeness, we just talked about this, making judgments about the probability of an event under uncertainty, or judging a situation based on how similar the prospects are to the prototypes the person holds in his or her mind. So this is where we get into broader generalizations. Availability heuristics, so the judgments about the probability of events by the ease with which examples come to mind. So the first thing you think about, the first probability, the first event, was the first available, so your brain just assumes it is the greater probability. We then have anchoring and adjustment heuristics, so which are a tendency to rely more heavily on the first piece of information offered, which is the anchor, and then the adjustment heuristic, which is it makes it significantly more challenging cognitively to move away from the anchor. Escalation of commitment, so continued investment in a decision based on the cumulative prior investment. So this is the sunk cost fallacy is most often what it's referred to. And one question that we often ask are biases and heuristics top down or bottom up. So that's from a cognitive perspective. Are these enforced frameworks from our higher order cognitive thinking, or are these decisions that are made long before things get to our cognitive processing? Are these deeper, more lizard brain type governed decision, and which makes it more difficult for human error? So those are some of the things we look at. And what's important also to note is this list of heuristics is definitely not exhaustive. There is an ever-growing list of these, but these are kind of some of the main ones that you'll run into. Some other heuristics that we'll look at, contagion heuristics. So avoid association with others that are viewed as contaminated. So if you perceive that somebody has some association with some other person, you may make assumptions that there is a commonality of thinking, or that it's more probably likely. Then we have naive diversification. So this is something you'll see when people are making several choices at once. They'll tend to diversify more than if they're making the same decision sequentially. So if you ask somebody a series of questions about who should do a task, they will answer you more validly or in a more objective way than if you say these 4 people need to do stuff, who's going to do it? And then what you'll see is people tend to diversify that decision, so they'll give pieces to each person, where in a sequential decision making they may not do that. Effort, so worth of something is determined by the amount of effort taken to get it. You should be very familiar with this if you are in college at all. We tend to value those things in that way, even though it isn't always representative of reality. And then framing. So this is a huge one, especially when we look at advertising and different ways of designing interactions or structuring decisions. So whether a question is framed as a gain versus a loss will influence an individual's risk preference, even if that framing is incorrect. people tend to accept that framing by default. So that's something to kind of be on guard about in your own decision making. So when we look at failures of decision making, so what do descriptive theories say? The behavioral economist type answers. They ascribe failure to heuristics and decision process breakdowns. The framing of the decision problem can be the really difficult one that throws in their way, because they're looking at it generally from an economic perspective. So they assume that if the choice is well structured, there is a clear path towards solution. When it's ill structured, there's no readily available path towards a solution. You can tend to get bogged down with irrelevant information, and it requires kind of reframing the problem internally to solve it. They also will put forward this isomorphic problem where the formal structure of a decision might match some previous experience, but the content differs. This can be kind of a structure problem that will show up in logic, as well as the difference between validity and soundness. So now, naturalistic theories, they ascribe failure to a larger context. So again, the focus is on how humans actually make decisions. So the idea is that the larger context will adapt to the human decision-making process. So there may be incorrect goals or priorities. So you might have you selected the incorrect goal, you prioritized an incorrect goal, or maybe the likelihood of success was judged poorly. Maybe you have incorrect internal pattern matching. This is kind of, we talked a little bit about rule-based errors. This can be where one of those type of instances will live. And then incorrect mental simulation or evaluation of options. So our active engagement with the features and characteristics of the decision end up running afoul in some way. It could be by bias, could be poor training, we don't have experience in doing this, that kind of thing. But those are all different ways of understanding decision-making failures, but these ones are more focused on the broader environment and the broader context of decision-making. There's also fallacies. So this is one we talked a little bit earlier about, the sunk cost fallacy. So that's one example of one. But there's also negative and positive transfers. So solving an earlier problem makes it harder to solve a later one. Functional fixedness, so a tendency to perceive an item only in terms of its most common use. So this image here of a hammer being used as a paperweight. A hammer can totally work as a paperweight because it is heavy enough. It has nothing to do with its hammering essence. Then we have the mental set fallacy. So we persist in using past problem-solving strategies, even if they've not been successful. They're familiar, so our brains will tend to do that first. Kind of a slight amalgamation of the availability heuristic. And then assuming unnecessary constraints. So this is one of these great puzzles of connect all the points with 4 straight lines without moving the pen from the paper. And there's a lot of different ways of solving these kind of brain teasers in a way that a lot of times these puzzles are taking advantage of some psychological or cognitive shortcoming that's making us narrow the problem greater than it really is.